At 66, Dexter Manley speaks with a voice that trembles, not from fear, but from the weight of memory. His journey through the National Football League was a storm of brilliance and chaos. A career carved in equal parts glory and ruin. They called him the Secretary of Defense, a title born from his relentless pursuit of quarterbacks. Yet behind the sacks and the roar of the crowd, there were darker truths he carried silently. Until age and time forced confession. Manley was a man of contradictions. His smile lit up rooms, but his secrets cast shadows over entire locker rooms. He was fearless on the field, but vulnerable off it, battling demons that made him as infamous as he was legendary. Addiction stalked him, controversy consumed him, yet his presence was undeniable. He became a figure who embodied both the heights of dominance and the depths of despair. What we uncover today are not just highlights or statistics. These are the 5 hidden truths that defined his career. The grudges, betrayals, and unspoken battles that never left him. Why did a man with so much talent, so much promise, walk a path so scarred? Why did Dexter Manley, the unstoppable force of the 1980s, carry such rage and heartbreak long after the final whistle? This is not just the story of a player. It is the confession of a man who lived through triumph and tragedy, and who finally revealed the truths that defined his NFL career. Dexter Manley's name echoes through the annals of football history, as both a warning and a legend. Born in 1959 in Houston, Texas, he grew up in a world that was as unforgiving as the game he would later dominate. The son of a working-class family, he learned resilience before he ever touched a football. Streets hardened him, poverty shaped him, and by the time he reached high school, his athletic gifts were undeniable. His speed and raw power separated him from his peers, a natural-born predator on the field. At Oklahoma State University, Manley became more than just an athlete. He was a spectacle. Quarterbacks dreaded his presence. Coaches built game plans around containing him, and fans roared when his number 72 appeared in the backfield. But beneath the surface, he hid a painful truth. He struggled with literacy, a secret so heavy it shadowed every classroom, every exam, every attempt to mask vulnerability in a world that demanded strength. For years, he carried that silence, ashamed to admit he could not read or write. The football field became both his escape and his disguise. When the Washington Redskins drafted him in 1981, he entered a franchise on the rise. Joe Gibbs was building a dynasty, and Manley became its ferocious enforcer. His relentless pass rush earned him 2 Super Bowl rings, a Pro Bowl nod, and the admiration of fans who saw him as the embodiment of raw defense. On Sundays, he was a nightmare for linemen, a man whose speed off the edge felt almost supernatural. By the mid-'80s, he had carved a reputation as one of the most feared defensive ends of his generation. Yet, even as the trophies piled up, his demons grew louder. Drugs crept into his life, first as a shadow, then as a chain that tightened around him. In locker rooms, whispers spread. In press rooms, questions mounted. And in quiet moments, Dexter himself wrestled with a secret war. To the public, he was a warrior in pads. To those closest, he was a man spiraling, held together by equal parts pride and desperation. The contradiction defined him. He was both hero and cautionary tale. Adored by fans but questioned by officials, celebrated by teammates but distrusted by the league. His battles with authority mirrored his battles with himself. Every sack he delivered was matched by another step closer to personal collapse. Washington adored him, but the NFL began to see cracks in the foundation. This is the crucible where his 5 hidden truths were forged. Rivalries with teammates and coaches. Betrayals that cut deep. Scandals that tainted his name. These moments were not just side notes. They became the core of Dexter Manley's story. For every roar of victory, there was a whisper of downfall. For every Sunday triumph, a Monday shadow followed. The stage is set. Dexter Manley's rise was glorious, but his truths were darker than most dared to imagine. #5. Rivalry with offensive tackles. In the trenches of the National Football League, wars are fought one play at a time. For Dexter Manley, the enemy was always clear. The offensive tackle across from him. These men were the gatekeepers, the only line between him and the quarterback. They were the ones tasked with slowing down his fury. And many of them became unwilling characters in his legend. Among these, Joe Jacoby, Ironically, his own Washington teammate on practice fields was a constant test. Jacoby was massive, 6'7", with arms like tree trunks. In practice, Manley often lined up against him, each rep an explosion of force. Jacoby represented the league's best, and Dexter sharpened his claws against him daily. He admitted later that these battles made him hate the position itself. Tackles stood as obstacles to his destiny, and in his mind, they were enemies long before game day began. The clash of styles fueled the fire. Manley relied on speed, quickness, and explosive first steps. Tackles tried to counter with weight, leverage, and brute strength. Every snap was a collision of physics, pride, and survival. To Dexter, being blocked was humiliation, a scar on his soul. He carried those scars like a warrior counting wounds, and the resentment toward those who stopped him never faded. The rivalry crystallized in 1986, when Washington faced the New York Giants. Dexter lined up against Brad Benson, a seasoned tackle who prided himself on discipline rather than flash. For 4 quarters, they traded blows. Manley rushed with fury. Benson countered with calm technique. At one point, Dexter swung through, slamming Phil Simms to the turf. But Benson had already absorbed most of his force. The crowd cheered the sack, yet Dexter walked back to the huddle shaking his head. He knew Benson had neutralized him more often than he preferred to admit. That game became iconic for reasons beyond the scoreboard. On the sidelines, Manley raged. He screamed at coaches, at linemen, even at himself. He wanted domination, not just plays. And in that frustration, the truth emerged. He never forgave offensive tackles who got the better of him. In his mind, they robbed him of glory, of sacks that could have rewritten his legacy. He once told a teammate that he dreamed of facing nothing but tight ends and backs, because tackles cheat you out of history. To Dexter, every block was personal. Yet, even as he hated them, he needed them. The tougher the opponent, the greater the triumph when he broke through. In many ways, offensive tackles became his shadow rivals, shaping his career more than quarterbacks did. He could live with a quarterback escaping his grasp, but being stonewalled by a tackle left wounds that lingered for years. The cold truth is this: Dexter Manley never forgave the men who stood in front of him. He viewed offensive tackles not as opponents, but as betrayers of destiny. They were the faceless walls that tried to silence his roar. And for a man who defined himself by breaking through barriers, that was an insult he carried to the grave. The grudge never died. The rivalry with tackles, whether in practice or on Sundays, lived inside him as the first of his hidden truths. #4. Clash with the NFL Commissioner's Office. If offensive tackles were Dexter Manley's battlefield rivals, the league office became his looming enemy. The NFL Commissioner's Office was supposed to represent order, discipline, and control. For Dexter, those values felt like shackles. He was a man driven by chaos, fueled by defiance, and unwilling to bow to authority. The clash between Manley and the league's highest power was inevitable, and it became one of the darkest truths of his career. Throughout the 1980s, drug use quietly haunted the NFL. For many players, the culture of painkillers, stimulants, and recreational substances blurred into the rhythm of the season. For Dexter, cocaine became both his release and his curse. At first, it was a secret vice, hidden in locker rooms and after-hours parties. But soon, his performances, his mood swings, and his erratic behavior drew attention. The league began testing, and the walls closed in. The commissioner's office wanted order. They issued warnings, suspensions, and ultimatums. Dexter, in turn, responded with denial, anger, and rebellion. He failed not one test, not two, but eventually 4. Each failure deepened the feud. Each meeting with league officials became a trial, where Dexter felt stripped of dignity, cornered like prey. He viewed them not as guardians of the game, but as executioners determined to erase his name. The most infamous moment came in 1989, when the NFL delivered its final blow. After repeated violations, Dexter Manley was banned for life. It was a crushing decision. In the eyes of the commissioner's office, it was justice. In Dexter's eyes, it was betrayal. The league that had cheered his sacks, that had celebrated his ferocity, now cast him out as an outcast. He once admitted in an interview that walking away from football was harder than giving up cocaine. "The game was my life," he said, his voice trembling. "When they took that, I had nothing." The clash was not only about rules and drugs. It was about power. The NFL wanted to prove it could control its stars, even the brightest, even the most feared. Dexter refused to bow. His entire career had been built on breaking rules of physics, breaking lines of protection, breaking through what others thought unbreakable. But against the commissioner's office, he could not win. He became a cautionary tale, a headline, a name etched in scandal. Yet even in disgrace, he never let go of the bitterness. He believed the league punished him more harshly than others because he was outspoken, because he refused to play the role of obedient soldier. He saw hypocrisy in a system that profited from players' pain, yet condemned them when that pain led to addiction. The league insisted they were saving the game. Dexter believed they destroyed him to make an example. The cold truth is this: Dexter Manley never forgave the NFL's leadership. He carried that anger through years of recovery, through prison sentences, through redemption tours. In his heart, the commissioner's office was not a protector of football, but the shadow that ended his career. The grudge never faded. The wound never closed. It was the second of his hidden truths, a war with authority that shaped his legacy as much as his sacks ever did. #3. The silent rival. His own illiteracy. For most players, the fiercest rival lived on the opposite sideline. For Dexter Manley, one of his deadliest enemies followed him everywhere. It was invisible in stadium lights, inaudible in locker rooms, but crushing in classrooms and press conferences. That rival was illiteracy. The inability to read and write haunted him throughout his career, a secret so shameful that he guarded it like a state secret. Growing up in Houston, the young Manley slipped through the cracks of the school system. Teachers praised his athletic gifts, but quietly overlooked his academic struggles. At Oklahoma State, the problem deepened. Coaches wanted his sacks, not his essays. Tutors smoothed the way, classes were bent, and Dexter advanced without the foundation most took for granted. By the time he entered the NFL, he was a professional athlete who could not read a newspaper, fill out a form, or decipher a playbook without help. On the field, his body did the talking. He crushed quarterbacks, made headlines, and heard the roar of crowds. But off the field, every autograph session, every contract meeting, every public appearance became a minefield. He memorized phrases, leaned on others, and prayed no one would expose him. In interviews, his charisma masked the fear inside. Yet the weight never left. Illiteracy was more than an obstacle. It was humiliation wrapped in silence. The defining moment arrived in 1986, when Dexter appeared before Congress to testify about drug use in the NFL. Cameras flashed, politicians leaned forward, and the world expected eloquence from one of the league's brightest stars. Instead, when asked to read a prepared statement, he froze. Stumbling, stammering, his secret spilled into the open. America learned that one of the NFL's most feared defenders could not read. The revelation sent shockwaves through the sports world. Critics accused universities of exploiting him, pushing him through without education. Others mocked him, using the confession as proof that football players were brutish, not intelligent. For Dexter, it was devastation. The shame burned deeper than any sack ever delivered. He felt naked, stripped of the armor he had always worn. That hearing became his personal battlefield. A humiliation replayed in his mind long after the cameras turned away. Illiteracy was not just a personal burden, it became a wedge in relationships. Teammates respected his dominance, but some whispered about his struggles. Coaches simplified instructions, sometimes unintentionally belittling him. Dexter, proud and fiery, often lashed out, mistaking pity for disrespect. His own silence bred anger, and that anger spilled onto fields and into confrontations. The truth was always chasing him, always threatening to eclipse the man he wanted the world to see. Over time, he fought back. In retirement, he entered literacy programs, publicly admitting his pain, working to teach others. But even then, the scars remained. The boy who slipped through classrooms, the young man who passed exams he never took, the professional who hid behind teammates, never forgave the system that allowed it. He viewed it as betrayal, a conspiracy of negligence that left him unprepared for life. The cold truth is this: Dexter Manley never forgave his illiteracy. He hated the weakness, the silence, and the humiliation it carved into his soul. He hated the institutions that failed him, and he hated the reflection in the mirror that carried the shame. It was not an opponent he could sack, or a commissioner he could confront. It was a ghost that lived within him. The third of his hidden truths, and perhaps the one that cut deepest of all. #2. Betrayal by teammates and locker room isolation. Football is a game built on brotherhood. The locker room is meant to be sanctuary, a fortress of trust where men bleed together and celebrate together. For Dexter Manley, however, that bond was never unbreakable. His fire, his flaws, and his battles with addiction often turned teammates into judges, and teammates into strangers. Among all his hidden truths, the sense of betrayal he carried from within his own team may have hurt most. In Washington, during the mid-1980s, the Redskins' locker room was filled with talent and ambition. Under Joe Gibbs, the team marched to 3 Super Bowl victories. Stars like Art Monk, John Riggins, Darrell Green, and others became household names. Dexter was part of that core, the defensive force that opponents feared. Yet behind the glory, fissures grew. Teammates admired his sacks but distrusted his lifestyle. The whispers about drugs, the erratic behavior, the confrontations with coaches, all eroded the unity that championship teams require. Manley was loud, brash, and often unpredictable. Some teammates celebrated his energy, others recoiled from it. When he showed up late to meetings, some saw a star abusing his privilege. When he exploded on the sidelines, some saw a warrior too unstable to control. Slowly, the room divided. Dexter, once the life of the party, began to sense the cold shoulders, the distance in conversations, the judgmental stares. The defining moment came in 1987. Washington was navigating the players' strike, a season torn apart by replacement games and internal fractures. Dexter, already battling his personal demons, felt the spotlight grow harsher. Reports of his drug use intensified, and teammates who had once defended him began to step back. Some refused to vouch for him in private conversations with coaches. Others distanced themselves socially, unwilling to be dragged into the chaos surrounding his name. For a man who defined himself by belonging to a team, that shift felt like a blade twisting in his back. The betrayal was not always open hostility. It was silence. When Dexter needed someone to shield him from reporters, silence. When he sat in meetings after another failed drug test, silence. The same men who celebrated sacks with him on Sunday no longer had his back on Monday. He once confessed later in life that he felt abandoned by my own brothers. That sense of desertion, of being left to drown while others sailed forward, scarred him permanently. The locker room, once his family, became a courtroom. Every mistake became evidence. Every outburst another count against him. Coaches tried to intervene, but the bond of trust was fractured. Dexter lashed out, sometimes blaming teammates for not protecting him, sometimes retreating into further isolation. The spiral accelerated. He played like a man possessed, almost desperate to prove himself on the field because he felt unwanted off it. Years later, after prison, after rehab, after reflection, he admitted that some of the blame was his own. He had broken trust with lies, with denials, with behavior that tested the patience of those around him. Yet even with that admission, he never fully forgave the teammates who turned their backs. In his heart, he believed loyalty should have endured, even when the storm raged hardest. The cold truth is this: Dexter Manley never forgave the silence of his own locker room. He saw teammates not only as brothers but as betrayers when the spotlight grew harsh. The grudge lingered beyond seasons, beyond retirement. It was the fourth of his hidden truths. A reminder that sometimes the deepest wounds are carved not by enemies, but by friends who walked away. #1. The fall from glory. Drugs, as his ultimate rival. Every rivalry in Dexter Manley's life circled back to one enemy that never wore a helmet, never lined up across the ball, and never played by rules: cocaine. It was the rival that stole his career, his reputation, his family, and nearly his life. Unlike tackles, commissioners, or teammates, this opponent lived inside him. It struck when the stadium was quiet, when the applause faded, and when the loneliness of fame crept in. In the early years, it seemed harmless. A line after a game, a celebration after a win. The culture of the 1980s. NFL was saturated with excess, and cocaine was its dangerous currency. For Dexter, it began as escape, a way to silence the pain of illiteracy, the whispers of betrayal, and the pressure of performance. But like all addictions, it soon consumed more than it gave. The turning point came in 1987, when Washington was chasing another Super Bowl run. Dexter, still a dominant presence on the field, was secretly spiraling off it. Missed meetings, unexplained absences, and volatile behavior became impossible to ignore. Coaches covered, teammates whispered, the media speculated. And yet, on Sundays, he still delivered sacks that electrified stadiums. It was a dual existence: the warrior under the lights, the broken man in shadows. The breaking point arrived in 1989. After multiple failed drug tests, the NFL imposed its harshest penalty: a lifetime ban. For Dexter, it was annihilation. In an instant, the game that had defined him since boyhood was gone. Headlines screamed scandal, fans felt betrayed, and the league washed its hands of him. He was no longer the Secretary of Defense. He was another cautionary tale, another fallen star. His descent after the ban was brutal. He served time in prison for drug-related charges. He alienated family and friends. He lost the money, the fame, the platform. At one point, he admitted he had nothing left but his addiction. "I was enslaved to it," he confessed years later. "I loved the game, but I loved the drug more, and it destroyed me." Those words carried the weight of a man who knew his greatest rival had beaten him long before the league did. Yet the story did not end in ashes alone. Dexter fought back, slowly, painfully. Rehab centers replaced stadiums. Support groups replaced locker rooms. Over years, he built a new identity, one not defined by sacks, but by survival. He became a public speaker, a symbol of resilience, a man unafraid to admit the darkest chapters of his life. And still, even in recovery, he carried the scars. Addiction was not an opponent he ever truly defeated. It lingered in memory, in temptation, in the constant battle for sobriety. The cold truth is this: Dexter Manley never forgave the drug that stole his life. He hated the way it made him lie, the way it made him betray his teammates, his family, himself. He hated the way it robbed him of years he could never reclaim. Cocaine was not just a substance. It was his greatest rival, the fifth and final hidden truth, the shadow that haunted the brightest and darkest corners of his NFL career. Beyond the tackles, the commissioner, the shame of illiteracy, the silence of teammates, and the chains of addiction, there was one rival Dexter Manley could never outrun: himself. More than any opponent, it was his own reflection in the mirror that carried the sharpest edge. Dexter was his own storm. His personality, larger than life, often turned destructive. He was impulsive, reckless, unwilling to listen to warnings. Coaches begged him to slow down. Friends urged him to seek help. But Dexter often chose the harder road: the hunger to prove himself, the refusal to admit weakness, the denial of his flaws, all fed the cycle. He became the architect of his own downfall. There were times he admitted this with heartbreaking honesty. In interviews long after his playing days, he said, "I was my worst enemy. Nobody could beat me like I beat myself." That confession cuts deeper than any statistic. It reveals a man who finally saw that the battles were not only against opponents or drugs, but against his own pride, his own refusal to ask for help. The cold truth is this: Dexter Manley's most enduring rival was the man he was when the helmet came off. A man who carried demons, who fought shadows, who sometimes chose destruction over healing. And yet, it was also this rivalry that shaped his redemption. By confronting himself, he began to rebuild. By admitting the enemy within, he finally started to win the only game that mattered in the end. Dexter Manley's life is a study in contradictions. A saga where triumph and tragedy ran parallel like two rails of the same track. To understand his legacy, one must look beyond the sacks, beyond the roar of stadiums, into the quiet truths he revealed in later years. For Dexter, legacy was never just about the game. It was about the battles that defined him, the scars that told his story, and the hidden truths that, in the end, became his confession. On the field, Manley was unforgettable. He was the relentless predator off the edge, the Secretary of Defense who terrorized quarterbacks throughout the 1980s. His quickness at 6'3" and over 250 pounds was astonishing. His first step was lightning, his hands violent, his energy unending. Fans in Washington adored him because he embodied everything they wanted in their team. Fearlessness, aggression, spectacle. He left an indelible mark on 2 Super Bowl victories, cementing himself as one of the greatest pass rushers of his generation. Yet the numbers and rings tell only part of the story. The truth is that Manley's career is inseparable from his demons. His battle with drugs, his illiteracy, his suspensions, and his eventual ban from the league are as much a part of his history as any sack. His rise and fall became symbolic of the era. It was a time when the NFL was both glamorized and scandalized, when players were lionized on Sundays but often left unsupported in private. Dexter became the face of both extremes. In many ways, his hidden truths connected to one another, each feeding the next. His illiteracy left him vulnerable to shame, which fed his insecurities. His insecurities drove him toward drugs, which spiraled into conflict with teammates and ultimately the league. His clashes with authority mirrored the clashes within his own heart. He was a man at war with himself and the system that built him. His legacy, therefore, is not a simple tale of dominance. It is a mosaic of brilliance and brokenness. But here is where his story turns. Dexter Manley did not vanish into the abyss. He rebuilt. He confronted his illiteracy, entering literacy programs, and publicly advocating for education reform. He faced his addiction, not always perfectly, but with the courage to admit it owned him. He spoke in schools, prisons, and community centers, warning others not to follow his path. In doing so, he transformed his pain into purpose. The very weaknesses that once humiliated him became tools for teaching, for helping others avoid the same fate. This duality is what makes his legacy cinematic. On one side, the image of him exploding past linemen, arms raised after another sack. On the other, the image of him standing humbly before young students, confessing that he could not read until adulthood. The contrast is powerful. It tells us that greatness and failure can coexist, that a man can be both cautionary tale and inspiration. To Washington fans, his legacy remains complicated but cherished. They remember the havoc he wreaked on Sundays, the pride he brought to their city. To the league, he remains both an embarrassment and an example of reform, proof that the NFL could not ignore addiction forever. To himself, Dexter carries the truth that his journey was never clean, never perfect, but still worth telling. The greater truth is this: Dexter Manley's story transcends football. It is about the cost of glory, the price of silence, the weight of demons carried too long. His hidden truths remind us that behind every helmet is a human being, fragile and flawed, who must navigate a world that demands perfection. He showed us that even legends fall, and that sometimes falling reveals more than victory ever could. When we look at Dexter's legacy, we do not see only a sack artist or a drug casualty. We see a man who lived at full speed, who burned bridges and rebuilt some, who lost almost everything, yet still stood to tell his tale. He lived both the dream and the nightmare of professional football. And in revealing his hidden truths, he gave us something more valuable than stats. He gave us honesty. Dexter Manley's life tells us that the game is more than touchdowns and trophies. It is also about the men who bear the weight of expectations, who stumble under it, and who sometimes rise again despite it all. Beyond trophies and glory, it was grudges, betrayals, and dark truths that defined him. And in that brutal honesty lies the true measure of his legacy. Dexter Manley's journey leaves us with a haunting question. What defines a legacy? The victories on the field or the battles fought in the shadows? His 5 hidden truths revealed a man who was both feared and fragile, unstoppable on Sundays, yet vulnerable in silence. They remind us that behind every great play is a human being carrying weight that no statistic can measure. So now the question turns to you. Which truth shocked you the most? Was it his war with offensive tackles, his feud with the commissioner, the revelation of illiteracy, the sense of betrayal by teammates, or the devastating grip of drugs that nearly ended his life? Or was it the bonus truth, the battle against himself, that felt most powerful? Do you believe Dexter was treated fairly, or was he punished more harshly because he refused to conform? At NFL Hidden Truths, we believe the golden age of football is filled with stories like Dexter's. Legends who conquered stadiums, but carried scars unseen. If you want more untold stories, more rivalries, More confessions from the icons of the 1960s through the 1990s, this is where you will find them. If you enjoyed uncovering Dexter Manley's truths, make sure to subscribe to NFL Hidden Truths. Leave a comment with your thoughts, share the story with fellow fans, and join us as we continue to reveal the hidden side of football's greatest legends. Because the game is not just about what happened under the lights. It is also about what was buried in the dark. And here, those secrets finally come to light.